Israel? Will America, if Israel attacks Iran, will America intervene to support them? I mean, so it's quite an important question, and I feel a bit like when the Third World War was about to break out over Russia and America, I was saying we should study Russian philosophy and at least understand what's going on there. I feel the same. We should really all study Iranian philosophy and Zoroastrianism to understand where this antipathy between the West and the East comes from. And I think it's founded on ignorance, which is spelled ignore. We ignore Persia in our higher education system, in our culture. So I'm happy to try and to augment our knowledge of that somewhat. So it was one of the oldest religions on the planet, founded by Zoroaster, a prophet from Balkh, which is a city in northern Afghanistan, which spoke a language very much like ancient Sanskrit. And he was a priest in essentially what was an ancient pagan Indo-European religious culture, very much like the Druids, say, in Britain at the time. He lived about 1750 BC. He was a man of great integrity, and he probably had some psychedelic experiences, because the Zoroastrians believe in a particular substance they called Homa, which is like the Sanskrit Soma, which is the Rig Vedas sing the praises of Soma. And in the Zoroastrian tradition, they sing the praises of Soma. And scholars of language say, well, hey, it's the same thing. And there's a big industry among archaeobotanists to try and work out what was Homa, what was Soma. It could have been cannabis. It could have been the magic mushrooms. We don't know. It's described. And the Zoroastrian priests seem to have forgotten what it was, which I think is a shame. But it's in their scriptures. And he had these magical visions, and then he wrote a series of texts called the Gathas. This is one of the oldest religious texts that have come down. They're written in this ancient language of very ancient Indo-European root language, and they are hymns to God. And God is defined as Ahura Mazda. That's the name for God in these hymns. Ahura Mazda is the Lord of Light, the Lord of Righteousness, and the Lord of Wisdom. And is the creator of mankind. And Zoroaster is his servant, his priest, his Magi. Because to be a priest of the Zoroastrian religion is to be a Magi. It was the priestly initiate class that were called, and that's the origin of our word magic. So because I've written about magic and peace magic, I'm interested in, the Magi, obviously. And I've known Zoroastrians from my time when I was an interfaith, leader of the World Conference on Religion and Peace, and went to the Vatican and went to conferences all over Europe, and I met some wonderful Zoroastrians. I went to their fire temple in Hampstead, it's been moved, but it's still there. The Zoroastrian temples are built around fire. So here is a little fire which I like to burn during these times, because we're having sacred discussions. And in the Zoroastrian fire temples, they have a fire burning all the time, 24/7. And they never let it go out. They keep fueling it. And some of the oldest temples, the flames have been going for over 1,000 years. They regard them as holy. And they exist in Iran, but also mainly in northern India, in the province of Mumbai, where they were called the Parsis. So they're a recognized minority religion in India. The reason they ended up there is because they left when Islam came. The Zoroastrian priests didn't want to become Muslim. And they took their holy flames to North India, which welcomed them with tolerance. And they took their scriptures. That's how we have the Gathas, right? it was much later that a Frenchman, Anquetil Duperron, he plays a role very similar to the James Bruce did in the Ethiopian saga. Anquetil Duperron, have our French guests heard of him? Okay, he went to India purposely, volunteered to join the French army in India because he wanted to go and get the Zoroastrian wisdom. He was a scholar, he was a learned man, a linguist, and he knew the Zoroastrians were in India. He saw no way of getting there apart from enlisting in the French army. And he was shipped off to India, who were at the time fighting the British. And within a few months, he said to his commanding officer, look, I cheated. I don't really want to be a soldier. I want to go north to Bombay and talk to Zoroastrians. And they had a drink of wine, and the guy gave him a meal and let him go. So Anquetil was able to then travel to the north. He got through the British lines, similar kind of bonhomie, and then befriended the Zoroastrians. He did what James Bruce did with the Ethiopians, and they entrusted him with their scriptures. It's an amazing story, very similar. And through many adventures, he finally got back to Paris with the Zoroastrian scriptures, which he then translated into French. And this hit European intellectuals like a bombshell, or a firework, to use a less military metaphor, and people realised its importance. So he translated the Gathas, and then it became a sort of a thing to read the Gathas. And that's why Nietzsche, who knew about all this, called his Thus Spake Zarathustra, his great epic philosophical text. So philosophers took Zoroastrian seriously, but I would say not seriously enough. Okay, just to rewind a bit, that's all the good news. The bad news is that the Zoroastrian texts, the Gathas and other later commentators on them, they had other subsequent writings, say that there's not only a good God, Ahura Mazda, there's also a diabolic force that's out to defeat the will of the good God. And that's called Angra Mainyu. And Angra Mainyu is kind of equi-powerful to Ahura Mazda. And they've been fighting this bipolar war since before the Earth was created. It's been a heavenly war. So you can watch videos of UFO type channelers who get information from different galaxies about all this, and they say there's aliens from this star system that are coming to Earth, and they're fighting the ones from this star system. And there are people that believe that, New Age UFO type cults. In a sense, it's just Zoroastrianism upgraded to Star Trek level. But that was the Zoroastrian idea, that there's a cosmic battle going on. And not only that, they also believe that in this titanic struggle between the forces of good and evil, Ahura Mazda has pity on mankind, and from time to time sends like a super powerful light worker, who they call the Saoshyant, which means the saviour. And Zoroaster was the Saoshyant for his epoch. And he won the battle against the forces of evil at that time, but didn't conquer it completely. Evil remained. And you could say there's a paradox here, because it's a bit like what happened to the Christian church, because Zoroastrianism was so successful, the kings of Persia adopted it as their religion, but then they misapplied it to militarism and tried to conquer everyone else and make them become Zoroastrians, which sort of is against the whole teaching of Zoroaster, I would say, who was for non-violence. He believed the spiritual struggle is a spiritual struggle, not a physical one. He was against violence. So the idea of having a Persian army invading Greece in the name of Ahura Mazda, for Zoroaster, would be a silly idea. But that's what the Persians tried, as we know, and failed. So what does the Saoshyant do? The Saoshyant in Zoroaster's time did this great magical work of victorious enlightenment. But Zoroaster said there'll be another Saoshant coming. He will complete the work I've done. I haven't managed to succeed everything. And so people were always saying, where's the Saoshant? Has he come yet? This is the thing, this is the word on the street in the Zoroastrian community. And the other thing that went in to feed Christianity, the whole concept of Christ, is a Zoroastrian concept. Christ, or Messiah, was learned as a concept by the Jewish tribes living in exile in Babylon, meeting Zoroastrians. And you can see the ancient rabbis poring over their texts and talking to Zoroastrian savants about all this. And they got this idea that, well, you know, he'll be born with us. We're going to birth the Messiah, the Saoshant. He'll be of the line of David. I don't think that was in the original script. I mean, that's not what Zoroastrians necessarily believe. He may be, but he could be born on the Isle of Orkney. He could be a woman. You know, who is going to be the Saoshant is a moot point. There's nothing in the script that predicts. I mean, of course, Orthodox Zoroastrians would say he's going to be Persian. Anyway, long story short, the idea was adopted into Judaism, became a foundation belief, and then it became the foundation of Christianity. Christians believe Christ was the Saoshant for this epoch, even if they've never heard of Zoroastrianism, and most of them haven't. What's interesting is there's a clue in the New Testament when it says, when Jesus was born, 3 Magi come to honour him. 3 Zoroastrian priests turn up to worship baby Jesus. I mean, what's going on there? You know, I mean, it's as if, well, you can think that one through. I think there's a huge impact of Zoroastrianism on the birth of the messianic ideas in Judaism, which is not talked about by Gershom Scholem, by the way, who's the great expert on the messianic idea in Judaism. He doesn't do it justice. And that is what makes me really annoyed at Netanyahu wanting to kill all the Iranians when they gave birth to the whole messianic idea in Judaism. And also, it was the Zoroastrian king Darius who set the Jews free to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. So I mean, the Iranians are heroes to the Jews. So Netanyahu is acting like Ahriman. He's acting like the Antichrist, the anti-Saoshant. Not read his stuff. So that's the other thing. And then what about Islam? Yes, Zoroastrianism hugely impacted Islam because some of Muhammad's earliest followers were Zoroastrians, particularly in Salman Rushdie's famous novel where he talks about the satanic verses. Salman the Parsi, who was a very close friend of Muhammad, possibly helped write down the Quran, heard a lot of it. He decided Muhammad was the Saoshant and that he would promote him and support it and launch the Quran, and he was one of his most faithful disciples. And they would have had conversations about all this. And also, in my commentary on the Quran, I've proved that Muhammad on mission for Khadija and the trading world that he was doing would have gone to Hira, which was the gateway between Mecca and Medina and the Persian Empire, which was a Zoroastrian empire at the time. It was in southern Iraq, a famous city called Hira, which was run by Christian Arabs. And it had loads of Zoroastrians visiting there as merchants. And Muhammad would have gone there from Mecca. It was one of their major trading places. And a lot of what's in the Quran he would have picked up in Hira, in my opinion. I've kind of proved this in my commentary. No other commentators on the Quran have even mentioned this. I don't know why. It's just, you know, it needs to be amended so that we understand this. If we're going to save this planet from mutual destruction over who's the best Messiah, we've got to understand the origin of it. And these Zoroastrians have, I think, the last word when it comes to it. And that's why going to war against Iran is absurd and totally anti Ahura Mazda's will. Then there's another thing I should tell you about that's interesting. This is why it's interesting philosophically, right? There was another movement within Zoroastrianism which said this idea of an eternal war between good and evil, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, is a bit simplistic. Maybe there's a third force that's even bigger than them both, from which they both emanate. And there was a movement within Zoroastrianism which said there was, and it was called Zurvan. And that meant infinite time. And a scholar at Oxford University, Zana, wrote a huge 600-page study of Zurvanism as a thought movement in Zoroastrianism. And that influenced, I think, the card in the tarot called Eon, which is the card of infinite time. And, I've talked about Eon. Zoroastrianism influenced esoteric currents in the Hellenistic era. They were trading, Silk Road. And so things like Mithras was another very important deity in Zoroastrianism. Mithraism became a big thing in the empire. There were Mithraic lodges in London and Bordeaux and Paris and Rome, and it was a really big thing. Mithras was, if you want, he was a deity of light, a bit like the Saoshant, but a sort of angelic form, who could defeat evil. So this is why everyone wanted to become an initiate of Mithraic worship. And I discovered today, doing some research, the Mithridatic Wars. There were 3 of them against the king of Pontus in Asia Minor, who was a Mithraic worshipper. And all this influenced people in that region and in Armenia as well. Armenian pagan religion is very Zoroastrianism based. So I think it's very important, and I think people in the West should study all this stuff, and we would be less keen to start wars against Iran. Did Alexander the Great know any of this stuff? I think he was an interested man. He would have wanted to find out, and Aristotle and Plato knew about all this stuff. And I have a book called The Zoroastrian Influence on Western Philosophy, written by a Baha'i, and it's a detailed study of how many Zoroastrian ideas got into Greek philosophy, and there's a lot of them. It's worth looking at. And the Baha'is, by the way, they believe their chap is the Messiah, the Saoshant, Baha'u'llah. He's a more recent prophet. He's doing the Saoshant thing. I've set up this group, the Council of the Council of Saoshants, avatars and messiahs. I'm saying let's all come round a table and compare and contrast and not fight wars over who's the best Saoshant. Is it Moses? Is it Abraham? Is it Jesus? Is it Mahavira? Is it Gandhi? Or is it Karl Marx? Karl Marx knew a bit about this and treated it with his normal humour. And the founder of the LSE, where I studied, who was a Fabian socialist, Thomas Davidson, and an intellectual philosopher, he knew, he had this wonderful quote. He said, yes, class war, French-German war, it's all going on, but we are going to build peace, and the hosts of Ahura Mazda will be helping us. It's a great throwaway line. That's the motto of the Labour Party, it should be, because he was one of their founders. Okay, there we are, that's Zoroastrianism. Is that any questions about that?
No, that was just very interesting.
It is
very interesting, yeah.
It really is, yeah. They know about this at SOAS because they have study centre for Persian spirituality and Zoroastrianism. There was a woman called Mary Boyce, who was professor of Zoroastrianism there, who influenced me.
Mary Boyce.
Mary Boyce, I don't think she's alive, but she's a genius intellectual. I know nothing in comparison to these people. I'm just a student of theirs. But and the key thing to cultivate as a Zoroastrian is Asha, good mind, and good words, and good deeds, and non-violence. Faith, prayer, reverence. And I have a dear friend, Zabanu Gifford, who's descended from the first Zoroastrian Member of Parliament in 19th century Britain. He was the first Asian to reach MP, and he was a Zoroastrian. She's his direct descendant. And Zabani runs a centre called the Asher Centre in the Forest of Dean. We've been friends for years. And, so there's a tradition in Britain of honouring the Zoroastrians and working together for world peace. May we succeed, is all I can say. Okay, I think we should turn to the gods because we don't know what the future will hold.
Take 5 minutes.
Sure, let's have a little break for a minute. Do you want to turn off the camera? We'll have a little tiny